Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are wading into what's maybe one of the most contested bits of American political history from the last 100 years or so.
Yeah, this whole idea that the Democratic and Republican parties basically, switched places.
Exactly. It's that claim, that shortcut, that their ideologies and their voters just flipped.
Right, and people point to the maps. You look at an old map, say 1896, Democrats dominate the South.
The rural, socially conservative South.
Then you flash forward to, 2000, and it's completely the opposite. Those same areas are deep red Republican.
The visual shift is, yeah, it's hard to deny something big happened.
And historically, you had the Democrats as sort of the party of the small government, agrarian South, often very conservative on social issues.
While the Republicans were more associated with the industrial North, federal power, maybe more progressive, at least early on.
And now,
Yeah.
it seems reversed. But, the reality is way, way messier than just a simple flip.
Which is exactly what we want to do today. We want to get into the weeds, unpack the complexity.
Cut through the myths.
Yeah, cut through the simple story. Look at how the platforms moved, how the factions inside the party shifted, and really focus on that big piece, the solid South, changing colors. What actually drove that?
And the first thing to get, right off the bat, is that this wasn't, instantaneous. It wasn't just 1964 and boom, switch flip.
Right.
No, this was slow. We're talking decades.
Yeah.
Really spanning from the 1930s, maybe even earlier in some ways, right through the end of the 20th century.
So we have to think about it in terms of these different party systems historians talk about.
Exactly. You've got the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, then Jackson versus the Whigs, the Civil War era, Reconstruction, the Progressive era.
And then the big one, the fifth party system, starting with FDR, that lasted for a long, long time.
And here's maybe the most crucial point for understanding why switch is too simple. Back then, the parties weren't ideologically pure like they mostly are today.
What do you mean?
Well, both the Democrats and the Republicans used to have significant progressive wings and very conservative wings all under the same roof. Big tents.
So you could be a liberal Republican or a conservative Democrat. That was
Okay.
normal?
Very normal. The tight sorting we see now, where if you're a Republican, you're almost certainly conservative, and if you're a Democrat, you're likely liberal or progressive.
Yeah.
That's the end result of this whole long process we're talking about. It wasn't the starting point.
Okay, let's unpack this. And maybe the best place to start is way back at the beginning, because there's this core conflict, right, about authority. That
Yes.
seems to run through everything.
Yeah.
So back to the very first parties. Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, or Democratic Republicans as they became known.
Yeah.
This is where we see that fundamental split, right, over government power.
Absolutely. It's the bedrock divide.
Yeah.
You had Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists. They were all about central authority.
Pro-North, pro-banking.
Exactly. Pro-finance, strong federal government over the states. They believed in, collective strength,
Right.
guided by a powerful central institution, kind of a top-down vision.
So in today's terms, that belief in authority in institutions, maybe classically conservative, even if their goals were sort of state-led economic modernization.
You could frame it that way. They were definitely the big government advocates of their time, using federal power to shape the nation.
And opposing them, Thomas Jefferson's crew.
The Democratic Republicans, totally different philosophy. Pro-farmer, deeply suspicious of central banks, big on individual rights, states' rights, anti-authority, basically.
Hands-off government, limited interference, classical liberalism, almost libertarian in a way.
Pretty much. And that core tension, central power versus local control, individual liberty versus collective structure, that's the thread. The names change, the issues change, but that philosophical fault line, it's always there.
Okay, fast forward a bit to Andrew Jackson, the Jacksonian Democrats, still anti-authority.
Very much so. But with this added layer of intense populism, Jackson was a complex figure, a mix of populist right and left impulses, you could say, but fundamentally defined by his opposition to elite institutions.
Like his famous war against the Second Bank of the United States.
Exactly. He saw the bank as corrupt, aristocratic, a tool of the powerful against the common man. So, yeah, still very much in that anti-central authority mold.
Yeah.
Favoring states' rights, individual rights over this perceived federal overreach.
And it's interesting, you mentioned this populist streak was sometimes at odds even with the Southern elite within his own party.
Oh, definitely.
Hmm.
Jackson, despite being a Southerner and a slave owner himself, had major conflicts with the planter aristocracy's leaders, like John C. Calhoun.
Calhoun, the nullification guy, claiming states could just ignore federal laws.
Right. And Jackson, while a states' rights advocate, saw that extreme version as a direct threat to the Union itself. There's that famous, maybe apocryphal story about his regrets.
That he didn't hang Calhoun and Henry Clay.
Yeah. I mean, whether he actually said it or not, it reflects that deep tension. Calhoun represented that entrenched Southern elite power base that Jackson's populism, in theory, was supposed to be fighting against. It shows the cracks within the Democratic coalition even back then.
But those cracks got completely blown open by the issue that would define the mid-19th century: slavery.
That just ripped everything apart. The question of whether slavery could expand into new territories, it fractured the parties along sectional lines.
Especially the Democrats.
Totally. The Southern wing, representing the planters, demanded slavery's expansion. Northern Democrats, they couldn't sell that back home. Their voters wouldn't stand for it.
Which led to that chaotic 1860 convention where the party just imploded.
Walk out. Southern delegates left, nominated their own candidate, Breckinridge. The Northern Democrats stuck with Stephen Douglas. 2 Democratic tickets.
Creating the opening for the new guys on the block.
The Republicans, yeah. They were formed specifically to stop slavery's spread. And they were purely a Northern party at that point. Zero presence in the South.
So with the Democrats split, Lincoln wins with, what, less than half the popular vote?
Just 40%.
Yeah.
It perfectly illustrates how deep that sectional divide had become.
And after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, that divide just solidified, right? You have radical Republicans in the North pushing for change.
Pushing for federal power to enforce rights for formerly enslaved people, clashing directly with the Southern Democrats who wanted to restore the old order, like you see in those campaign posters contrasting, say, a Union General Republican against a Redeemer Democrat. It was purely sectional.
But then Reconstruction ends in 1877. What happens to the South then?
It becomes the Solid South. For the next, 80, 90 years, Southern politics are just completely dominated by these Redeemer Democrats.
One-party rule.
Absolutely built on the mythology of the lost cause, blaming Northerners, and, crucially, enforcing white supremacy.
And that enforcement wasn't just talk. It was baked into the system.
Oh, entirely. Starting around 1890, lasting into the early 1900s, every single former Confederate state rewrote its constitution or passed laws explicitly designed to stop black people, and often poor whites too, from voting.
The disenfranchisement laws, poll taxes,
literacy tests, which were, applied completely subjectively.
If you were black, you probably failed. If you were a good white person,
you might get a pass through a grandfather clause or some loophole. Yeah. Complex residency rules, too, all designed to massively shrink the electorate and lock in Democratic control.
And wasn't this partly a reaction to a challenge from the populists?
Exactly. The People's Party in the 1890s, they scared the Democratic establishment because they were actually building alliances between poor white farmers and black farmers.
Biracial alliances based on shared economic interests like fighting the railroads and banks.
Right. Pushing for progressive economic reforms. Figures like William Jennings Bryan tapped into that energy. And the response from the Southern Democratic elite: crush it. Use fraud, use violence, and use these new disenfranchisement laws to destroy that biracial movement and ensure their one-party rule couldn't be threatened again.
So understanding the Solid South means understanding it wasn't just conservative. It was institutionally rigged to stay Democratic and conservative for generations. That was the bedrock Southern wing of the National Democratic Party. Okay, moving into the early 20th century, the Progressive Era. This is where the National Democratic Party really starts to shift leftward, isn't it? Even while the Solid South stays put.
Yeah, the tension starts building. The Progressive Era saw reforms bubbling up everywhere, in both parties, actually. But for the Democrats, William Jennings Bryan really set the course.
The great commoner ran for president 3 times.
And he's basically the father of modern American left-wing populism, you could argue. Advocated for income tax, direct election of senators, regulating big business.
Real progressive stuff for the time.
Absolutely. And he often found allies in the South, temporarily at least, by framing his fight as being against the big money elites back east. But his core message, equality, social reform, using government for the common good, was fundamentally at odds with the Jim Crow South.
So the National Party's moving one way, the Southern wing is dug in another.
Precisely. It shows the national identity was already evolving towards, more government intervention for social aims, even as its Southern base resisted.
What about the Republicans during this era? Weren't they also progressive friendly for a while? Teddy Roosevelt?
Absolutely. TRR was a huge progressive force, But his break from the GOP in 1912, forming the Bull Moose Party, that was a pivotal moment.
Split the Republican vote, let Wilson win.
Right. But more importantly, for the long term, it weakened the progressive wing within the Republican Party. It allowed the more traditional, conservative, pro-business wing, like Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, to really consolidate control heading into the 1920s. Back to laissez-faire.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the Great Depression and FDR.
Exactly. The Republicans were associated with the crash, and the Democrats under FDR were ready with a completely different vision. The New Deal.
And this creates the famous New Deal coalition. Talk about a strange mix.
Oh, it's one of the weirdest, most consequential alliances in U.S. history. FDR basically glued together Northern progressives, city machines, labor unions, African Americans moving north.
All drawn to the New Deal's promise of economic relief and government help.
Yeah. And then the Solid South. The same conservative Democrats who controlled the South for generations.
Why did they stick around?
Party loyalty was huge. Generations of voting Democrat. Plus, the New Deal poured enormous amounts of federal money and projects into the underdeveloped South. Dams, electrification, farm supports.
So economic interests kept them in the fold, even if they hated the National Party's growing liberalism.
Pretty much. It was a marriage of convenience. Support the economic programs, but quietly or not so quietly fight like hell against anything that threatened the Southern social order, especially on race.
And this internal opposition wasn't just grumbling, right? It had a name.
The Conservative Coalition. This is absolutely crucial for understanding how the South eventually left. It wasn't just a sudden break. It was a long-term internal resistance movement.
How did it work?
It was basically an informal but very real voting bloc in Congress. Conservative Southern Democrats would team up with anti-New Deal Republicans.
To block legislation.
Constantly. They'd work together to kill or water down anything they saw as too liberal, too socialist, too much federal overreach, labor rights, civil rights, expanding welfare programs. They fought it all.
How could they be so effective if they were Democrats working against their own party?
Seniority. Because the South was a one-party system, Southern Democrats stayed in Congress forever. They chaired all the powerful committees, and they had the filibuster in the Senate. They could grind the national Democratic agenda to a halt whenever they wanted to.
So even when the country voted Democrat for president, the Southern wing in Congress acted like an opposition force allied with Republicans.
That's exactly right. This built-in conflict was just waiting to explode. And it relates to that counter-argument you sometimes hear. The one trying to deny the switch happened at all.
The argument about welfare. That Southern conservatives secretly wanted federal programs to control people, like a new form of slavery.
Yeah, it's a sort of convoluted argument. The idea is that since Southern conservatives always wanted social control, they wouldn't have left the party over programs like the Great Society. They would have stayed to use them for oppressive purposes. Therefore, the switch based on opposing welfare must be a myth.
But does the historical record actually support that? Did they stay and try to use those programs?
No, quite the opposite. The mass exodus of Southern conservatives began precisely when federal civil rights enforcement and Great Society programs were being implemented and expanded in the 1960s. They left in opposition to these programs.
So their actions contradict the idea that they wanted these federal programs.
Logically, yes. If they saw federal welfare as a new tool for oppression they desired, they would have fought to control it from within the Democratic Party. Instead, they fought its very existence, and then left the party largely because of it. Their stated reason, consistently, was opposition to federal power and states' rights. The same anti-authority principle they'd held for generations now applied to civil rights and welfare.
Which makes sense. Their objection was fundamentally about federal power infringing on what they saw as state matters, including race relations.
Right. And that often aligned perfectly with maintaining segregation. But the core objection, ideologically, was rooted in that anti-federal authority stance.
When did the first really big public crack appear in this uneasy coalition?
You could point to 1948. Harry Truman. He pushed for a surprisingly strong pro-civil rights plank in the Democratic platform that year.
And the Southerners reacted how?
Predictably, outrage. A whole faction walked out of the convention. They formed their own third party, the States' Rights Democratic Party, the Dixiecrats.
Led by Strom Thurmond, right, governor of South Carolina then.
That's the one. Ran explicitly on segregation and states' rights.
Did they have much impact?
They didn't win, obviously, but they carried 4 Deep South states and got over 1 million votes. It was a huge warning shot. It showed the Southern wing was absolutely willing to bolt if the National Party pushed too hard on civil rights.
But the final break didn't happen right away, and sometimes people forget that Republicans actually started making inroads in the South before the big civil rights battles of the 60s.
That's a really important point, often missed by those the sources call the Goldwater hyping hysterics. People who act like the Southern strategy began purely as a racial backlash in '64.
You mean Eisenhower?
Exactly. Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, actually won several Southern states in '52 and '56, Virginia, Florida, Texas, Tennessee, even Louisiana in '56.
That was pretty shocking back then, right? For a Republican to win in the solid South.
Unheard of. Eisenhower was the first Republican to really campaign down there seriously. He was a moderate, a war hero, fiscally conservative, anti-communist. He appealed to the growing middle class in the newly urbanizing parts of the South.
So the economic changes after World War II were already loosening the Democrats' grip.
Yes. As the South developed, got more white-collar workers, more suburbs, those voters started looking more like national Republicans in their economic views. They were voting based on class and fiscal concerns, sometimes before race became the dominant national issue driving the switch.
So an economic realignment was happening alongside, or even slightly before, the big cultural and racial realignment. That adds another layer of complexity.
It absolutely does. The South wasn't just waiting for a racial signal. It was already changing economically in ways that made it more receptive to the Republican message.
Okay, now we hit the 1960s. The pressure that had been building finally erupts. Race becomes the unavoidable wedge issue.
Yeah, after decades of the issue being basically stalled legislatively, the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board in '54 cracked things open, and then the pressure just mounted through the late '50s and early '60s.
And ironically, it's a Southern Democrat, Lyndon Johnson, who forces the final break.
LBJ. His legislative maneuvering to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was a masterclass in politics, but it was also the point of no return for the old Democratic coalition.
The last straw for Southern conservatives.
Absolutely. Federal government mandating integration, federal officials overseeing voter registration in the South. To them, this was the ultimate violation of states' rights, an assault on their way of life by the national progressive wing of their own party.
And we see some immediate, very public defections. Strom Thurmond again.
Right. He famously switched to the Republican Party in September '64, explicitly blaming the Civil Rights Act. A huge symbolic moment.
But here's where the counterargument comes in again, right? The people who say the switch is overstated, they point out that not all the leaders jumped ship immediately.
That's a fair and important point. The narrative sometimes makes it sound like every single Southern Democrat became a Republican overnight in 1964. And that's just not true for the leadership.
They mentioned figures like George Wallace.
Wallace, yeah. Fierce segregationist, ran for president multiple times, challenging the National Democrats. But he remained a registered Democrat his whole life.
And Robert Byrd from West Virginia, former Klansman, became a powerful Senate Democrat.
Exactly. Byrd is a complex case. He later renounced his past, but he certainly represented that conservative Democratic tradition for decades. So the argument is, if these key figures didn't switch, how complete was the switch, really, at least among the elite?
What's the explanation for why they stayed?
Well, for many, especially those in Congress, they didn't need to switch parties to maintain their power or oppose the national agenda. They could do it from within, using their seniority and the conservative coalition tactics we talked about. They were powerful as Democrats. Switching might have actually hurt them locally initially.
Okay, so the leadership transition was slower, more complex. But what about the voters? Did they switch more quickly?
Oh, the voter realignment is undeniable. Yep. And the 1964 election is the textbook example. LBJ versus Barry Goldwater.
Goldwater, the Republican nominee.
Right. And the data from that election shows a massive shift, especially among African-American voters.
You mentioned this earlier. The jump was huge.
Astonishing. In 1960, maybe half of black voters identified as Democrat. By '64, after the Civil Rights Act, it jumps to over 80%. And it's stayed incredibly high ever since, like 85, 90, 95% Democratic. A massive permanent realignment based on that issue.
And on the flip side, white Southern conservatives.
They went the other way. Look at the map for '64. The Deep South states, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, they all voted for Goldwater, the Republican. Places that hadn't voted Republican since Reconstruction.
While at the same time, states that were reliably Republican flipped to LBJ.
Exactly. Places like Vermont and Maine, hardcore Republican states that even voted against FDR in his landslide 36 win, they went big for LBJ. It's a classic geographic realignment. The parties were trading bases over the issues of civil rights and the role of government.
Now, Goldwater himself is interesting here. His opposition to the Civil Rights Act wasn't framed explicitly in racial terms, was it?
No, and that's key. Goldwater had a somewhat mixed record on race. Personally, he'd supported earlier civil rights bills, belonged to the NAACP in Arizona. His public argument against the 1964 Act was purely constitutional.
States' rights, federal overreach.
Exactly. He argued Congress didn't have the authority under the Commerce Clause or the 14th Amendment to regulate private businesses or dictate local school policies in that way. It was a small government, anti-federal authority argument.
But that message landed perfectly with Southern conservatives who were resisting integration.
Perfectly. It allowed them to frame their opposition not just as defending segregation, but as defending the Constitution, defending states' rights against an overbearing federal government. It gave their resistance an ideological justification beyond pure racism.
So, intentional or not, Goldwater's platform became the vehicle for those voters to leave the Democratic Party.
It absolutely did. It crystallized the conflict. Democrats were now clearly the party of federal intervention and the expanding welfare state. Republicans were the party of limited government and states' rights. And for Southern conservatives, that choice was finally clear.
So 1964 sets the stage. Goldwater loses badly overall, but he wins the Deep South. This seems to signal to the Republicans there's an opportunity here.
A huge opportunity.
Right.
And this leads directly to the formulation of what becomes known as the Southern Strategy.
Which is basically what? The deliberate Republican plan to win over white Southern voters.
That's the standard definition, yeah. It's usually presented as a conscious, top-down effort by Republican leaders, starting seriously with Nixon, to appeal to the racial anxieties and resentments of white Southerners who felt left behind or attacked by the civil rights movement and cultural changes.
Nixon's 1968 campaign is often seen as the prime example. How did he approach it?
Very shrewdly. Nixon and his team, working with Southern figures like Strom Thurmond, who's now a Republican, realized they couldn't win the whole South outright. Not yet. George Wallace was running.
The segregationist third-party candidate.
Right. Wallace was expected to carry the Deep South states, the most resistant to integration. So Nixon didn't really compete hard there. He conceded those states to Wallace.
Where did Nixon focus instead?
The Upper South and the border states. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky. Places that were less intensely segregationist than Mississippi or Alabama, but still had large numbers of white voters uneasy about riots, crime, and the pace of change.
And his message there was?
Law and order, states' rights. He talked about appointing conservative judges, rolling back liberal Supreme Court decisions, language that, appealed to those voters' concerns.
But critics immediately saw law and order as coded language.
Exactly. To many civil rights leaders and liberals, it sounded like a way to signal solidarity with white backlash against black progress without using overtly racist terms, a way to legitimize discrimination, essentially.
Did the strategy work for Nixon in '68?
It did. Wallace won the Deep South, but Nixon won those key Upper South and border states, which was crucial to his narrow victory over Hubert Humphrey.
And by his re-election in 1972?
Complete sweep. Nixon won every single Southern state, the first Republican ever to do that. The Southern strategy, whether you see it as primarily racial or economic or both, had clearly succeeded in fundamentally reshaping the electoral map.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the strategy didn't stop with Nixon. It arguably deepened and broadened under Reagan.
You could definitely say that. Reagan was masterful at weaving together different strands of conservatism that appealed strongly in the South and elsewhere.
How so?
He took the traditional Republican fiscal conservatism, tax cuts, balanced budgets, deregulation, and he fused it powerfully with social conservatism. Appealing to evangelical Christians, cultural conservatives worried about issues like abortion, school prayer, traditional values.
He brought in the Wallace voters, that white working-class populist base.
He absolutely did. Reagan's message resonated with them economically and culturally. And crucially, during the 70s and peaking in the 80s, the Republican Party was actively courting and integrating the burgeoning religious right movement.
Groups like the Moral Majority.
Jerry Falwell's group, yeah. And later, Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition. These groups provided the GOP with incredible grassroots organizing power, money, and dedicated voters, especially across the South. It built a local infrastructure that helped lock in Republican gains for a generation.
This brings us right into the heart of the debate about how this happened, the dog whistle idea.
Right. This is central to the Southern strategy narrative. The idea is that because explicit racism became unacceptable in politics after the 60s, Republicans used coded language dog whistles that only the target audience, racially resentful whites, would understand.
So things like talking about states' rights or welfare queens or being tough on crime.
Or opposing busing, or affirmative action. The argument, often citing quotes attributed to strategists like Lee Atwater, is that these were all ways to signal "I'm on your side" to white voters anxious about racial change without having to say the quiet part loud. It's about tapping into that cultural backlash.
Exploiting identity politics, essentially.
That's the accusation. But we have to be fair and present the other side forcefully. There's a strong counterargument for people who think the switch is a myth, or at least primarily non-racial. They really push back against this dog whistle interpretation.
Just their main point.
Their core contention is that the things labeled dog whistles, small government, free markets, lower taxes, opposition to Great Society welfare programs, aren't coded racism at all. They are, in this view, the legitimate core historical principles of American conservatism and the Republican Party, going way back.
So when Reagan campaigned on cutting taxes and shrinking government, he was just being a Republican,
Yeah.
not sending secret racist signal.
That's the argument. They'd say there's no concrete proof, no smoking gun memo showing Nixon or Reagan explicitly plotting to use coded racial appeals. They argue that interpreting basic conservative ideology as inherently racist is itself a political attack based on circular reasoning.
The circular reasoning being, we assume the South switched for racist reasons, therefore any message that worked in the South must have been racist.
Basically, yes.
Hmm.
That it imputes motive without sufficient evidence. They see dog whistle as an unfalsifiable accusation. How do you prove a message wasn't intended or received in a certain coded way by some people? They argue it shuts down debate about the actual policy substance.
Okay, so as impartial observers, how do we weigh these? On one hand, the language clearly resonated in a region grappling with racial upheaval. On the other, the language also represents long-standing conservative principles.
It's tough. You have to acknowledge the context. These appeals were made, and they did work, in a specific historical moment shaped by race. But the counterargument forces us to seriously consider the non-racial factors, especially the economic ones, which often get downplayed.
Right, the economic drivers.
Like,
You mentioned the democratic shift towards the center, sometimes called neoliberalism.
yeah, starting in the 80s with the Democratic Leadership Council, DLC, folks like Bill Clinton pushed the party towards more business-friendly policies, free trade, welfare reform, fiscal moderation, trying to win back those suburban voters.
Moving away from the old New Deal, strong labor focus.
Considerably. And this shift, according to one economic counter-narrative, alienated a lot of the traditional working-class base of the Democratic Party, North and South. Blue-collar voters who felt abandoned by the Democrats' embrace of globalism and corporate interests.
And these voters then became receptive to Republican populism.
Exactly. First, Reagan's blend of social conservatism and anti-government rhetoric, and much later, Trump's more nationalist, protectionist economic message, combined with similar cultural appeals. It argues the Democrats lost the working class partly through their own economic choices.
And the other big economic factor was the changing nature of the South itself.
This is maybe the strongest argument against a purely race-driven narrative. The class inversion, we touched on it earlier. Post-WWII, the South transformed economically.
From farms to factories and offices.
Dramatically. Agriculture just collapsed as a major employer.
Yeah.
Cities grew, suburbs boomed. You had millions of new white-collar workers, managers, professionals.
And these people, nationally, tend to vote Republican based on class interests. Lower taxes, less regulation.
Generally, yes. Wealthier, white-collar voters tend to align with the party perceived as better for business and their pocketbooks. So this argument goes, as the South developed its own large middle and upper middle class, those voters naturally started voting Republican, just like their counterparts in the North or West.
So the GOP didn't just win the South because of race. They won it because the South finally developed the kind of voters who vote Republican anyway, for economic reasons.
That's the core idea, that this fundamental economic and class realignment was happening before or alongside the racial politics and might have been just as, if not more, important in the long run. It makes the switch much more about economics and demographics than just a simple racial backlash story.
It's fascinating how all these layers interact. And the end result, the visual symbol of it all.
Charlottesville in 2017, as cited in the sources, is just jarring. You have people carrying the Confederate battle flag, the flag of the 19th century Southern Democrats marching under the banner of the modern Republican Party, defending a statue of a Confederate general, Robert E. Lee, who was himself a Democrat.
While the people protesting against them are aligned with the modern Democratic Party, the party that now represents the forces Lee fought against.
It's the perfect, albeit disturbing, snapshot of how completely the factions have realigned over 150 years. The sorting, as political scientists call it, is complete.
So after tracing this long, winding path, where does it leave us today? The consensus seems to be, yeah, the sorting is done. The parties are ideologically distinct now.
They really are. While switch might be too simple a word for that messy, decades-long process, the outcome is undeniable. The conservative, small government Democrats of the Solid South, their political descendants are overwhelmingly in the Republican Party today.
And the liberal, more pro-government intervention faction, they now define the Democratic Party.
Right. If you look inside the modern party tents, they're much more ideologically coherent, though still coalitions. The Republicans are broadly a coalition of, say, neoconservatives and Tea Party-style social conservatives.
The establishment wing and the populist wing?
Kind of. Neocons may be more focused on global affairs, institutions, traditional fiscal conservatism. The social conservatives more focused on cultural issues, grassroots activism, and a very strong anti-government, anti-tax sentiment. But they're united broadly by that small government philosophy.
And the Democrats, also a coalition.
Also a coalition. You've got the more establishment, centrist liberals, sometimes called neoliberals in this context, meaning pro-market but with regulation and safety nets, and then the more activist, progressive social liberals.
The populists on the left.
Yeah, often focused on identity politics, social justice, environmental issues, but again, united by a general belief in using the power of the state, using government to address inequalities and solve social problems, big government solutions.
So at the philosophical core, it boils down to Republicans, less government is better. Democrats, government action is needed.
That's the fundamental ideological sort that's happened. And geographically, it plays out in that stark urban versus rural suburban divide we see everywhere. Though, as the sources note, looking at county-level data often tells a more nuanced story than just state maps.
Right, you mentioned that fascinating correlation found in some analyses around the year 2000, linking the black population percentage with the percentage of female heads of household in predicting Democratic votes at the county level. Unpack that a bit more.
It's a really interesting statistical finding from that period. The analysis suggested that these two demographic factors tracked together very closely in predicting Democratic voting patterns. It wasn't just about race, it was about this combined demographics economic status.
Why would those two track together so strongly?
The interpretation offered is that single-parent households, regardless of race, often have a greater need for, and are therefore more supportive of, government social safety nets, public services, things like affordable housing, subsidized childcare, etc., policies typically championed by the Democratic Party.
So, the economic reality of needing more state support might align single mothers, white, black, or Hispanic, with the Democratic platform, creating this statistical overlap with black population density in many areas.
Exactly. It suggests that economic vulnerability and reliance on the state can be an incredibly powerful predictor of party allegiance, sometimes even more nuanced than looking at race or gender alone. It adds complexity to just saying, this group votes Democrat.
Which brings us back full circle to that enduring ideological conflict. The continuity is just amazing when you step back.
It really is. That core tension, authority versus anti-authority, it's been there since Hamilton and Jefferson. The pro-federal power, pro-central institution view has found its home, broadly, in the modern Democratic Party. And the anti-federal power, small government, decentralizing view has found its home in the modern Republican Party.
The parties swapped sides relative to that axis, bringing different groups with them over time, but the axis itself remains.
And you still see echoes of the different types of conservatism and populism, too. The sources draw a distinction between, say, the establishment conservatism of an Eisenhower or a Bush, and the more populist anti-establishment conservatism of a Jackson, a Wallace, or arguably a Trump.
Different flavors of being on the right, not monolithic.
Not at all. Trump's brand of nativist, protectionist, anti-elite populism is quite different philosophically from traditional GOP free market globalism. It taps into that older Jacksonian vein of conservative populism, perhaps.
And people still switch parties today, right? It's not totally frozen.
No, absolutely. It often happens now around specific figures. You see Governor Jim Justice in West Virginia switching from Democrat to Republican, explicitly citing alignment with Trump, or on the other side, Congressman Justin Amash leaving the GOP over his opposition to Trump. Individuals still move based on who leads the factions now.
But the big picture, comparing Congress now versus, say, under Hoover in the 1920s, the Southern dominance has completely flipped from Democrat blue to Republican red. That visual evidence alone makes the term switch understandable, even if it hides all this complexity we've discussed.
Precisely. The membership, the platforms, the geography, they shifted fundamentally. Switch is the shorthand, and it captures a real phenomenon, even if the full story is much richer and took a lot longer. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow, that was definitely a deep dive. So, to quickly recap the main turning points, FDR's New Deal sets up the unstable coalition. Truman's 48 platform signals the civil rights crack. The 1960s Civil Rights Acts forced the break, and then the Republican Southern strategy helps consolidate the shift.
It's a complex story, grounded in documented history. And understanding it means appreciating that political loyalties aren't fixed. They shift based on economics, philosophy, identity. Factions with different goals are always forming and reforming alliances based on the issues of the day.
And the great irony, just to state it one more time, the small government party of the rural South effectively became the big government party, often based in the urban North, and the big government party of the North eventually found its stronghold in the more anti-federal authority rural South. Quite the transformation.
So what does this all mean for us today? I think understanding this history is crucial because it reveals how these deep ideological divides, often rooted in real economic questions about the role of government, big versus small business, central banks can get tangled up with and sometimes completely overshadowed by social and cultural issues, race, religion, identity. These become the fault lines.
This raises an important question.
Yeah. Thinking about this long history, America has constantly been divided by these cultural battles, often leading to political gridlock that prevents addressing underlying economic problems. Is the intense polarization we see today, now that the factions are so neatly sorted, partly because it's just easier politically to stoke cultural grievances and identity politics than it is to forge consensus around complex economic solutions?
Are prejudice and cultural fear more powerful political tools than class consciousness?
Or is there maybe a deeper, almost temperamental division at play? The sources mention that the fight often seems to be over how to fix problems, big government versus small government, not always whether problems exist. Yet, we remain incredibly divided. Perhaps the founders, worried about faction, didn't fully grasp how effectively non-economic identities could be mobilized to create seemingly permanent emotional opposition between citizens. It makes you wonder about the interplay between our core beliefs and our cultural identities.
Definitely food for thought. A lot to chew on there about the nature of our divisions. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Great American Party Switch.
It was a pleasure.